Hi, I'm Steve. Welcome to the American Garage. Welcome back to the American Garage. Let's take a minute and talk about saw safety. Now, the reason that we're making this episode today is because recently I discovered that I have two friends who had both cut themselves on a table saw. So I decided we needed to go over this. Now, we talked about how to make good cuts and make precise cuts, which is also going to make you safe, using the table saw in our table saw episode. But today we're going to talk specifically about safety tips to keep your hands away from the saw blade. The name of the game is to keep all 10 of these, okay? So, and we also want to keep our eyes safe as well. So there's some different techniques that we can go through that will keep you safe. And if you do these things, you will minimize the risk of anything bad happening to you with your power tools. Now let's keep one thing in mind. A saw is made to cut. It wants to eat. That's all it knows. It doesn't care if it's wood, or if it's your finger, or if it's anything else. It's going to cut, okay? So since its job is to eat, we have to stay out of its path. So what we're going to do is talk about the different techniques to keep you out of the path of the saw. There are inherent risks and hazards in using power tools. But if we mitigate those risks by good practices, then we can safely use a tool like this to make wonderful things. Now, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you have a clear working area around your table saw or whatever power tool you're working with. Make sure that you have a safety zone around it. Now, if you don't have enough room in your garage, you can move the saw out onto the driveway and cut out there where you have plenty of excess space around you. Okay, the next thing is the saw itself. On top of the table, there is a no-go zone for your hands. And I marked it with this piece of tape right here. If you have to put your hands inside of this taped area, you're doing it wrong, and you're gonna get yourself in a risk of being cut, okay? Now, you may think, well, oh come on, I can get closer than that. If you think like that, then you will eventually get cut, okay? So the whole idea is, how can we do this safely? How can we make a nice, precise cut and keep our hands out of this area? And I'm going to show you some techniques and some different tools that you can use along with your table saw to make sure that that happens. The next thing is to stay out of the line of fire. Wherever your blade is, that's where you don't want to be standing. You don't want to be standing right here where a piece of wood could kick it back at you. And you don't want to be standing with your feet planted, because you can fall over, you can fall forward into the blade, and you don't have enough stability. So stand off to the side with a stance like this and feed the wood through. If something were to kick back, it's going to go that way instead of in your face. Okay, so that's the next thing. What we're going to look at here is how far the blade sticks above the wood. I'm going to crank this down just a little bit more so that the blade sticks up just barely above the wood itself. Okay? Now, I've got it set where I want it. Let me tell you why. Because if you're cutting and somehow your fingers did get there, it's not going to cut you any deeper than that, okay? Now, you will hear some folks talk about cranking it up to where, see each of the gullies between the teeth? Some people want it so that those gullies will be sticking up all the way. And the idea is that if the whole gully is nearly showing, then you're going to get a better cut because the material is going to be expelled through the top. Well, let me tell you about this, okay? This is not the way that my woodworking teacher taught me all those years ago. And if you think about it for a minute, this blade is turning this way. So it's going to cut the wood. The wood that's been cut is going to be in this little gully, and the blade is going to turn and it's going to expel it below. So when it comes back up, it should be clean. Now, if you're pushing it too fast and filling these little gullies, you're going to bog the saw blade down. So what you need to do is slow your cut down. Don't stop, but slow it down so you don't bog your blade down. But if we have it this high, we have a potential of cutting our finger off. Okay? So I would not recommend to cut with the saw blade set like this. So the first thing that you're going to need when you're working with your table saw is you need a good set of push sticks. Now you can get fancy ones from the store, or you can make your own out of a piece of scrap wood like these. All you need is a piece of wood that's long enough to keep your hands away from the blade with a little notch in the end. This way you can be pushing your wood through the saw and keeping your hands away from the blade. Now this is perfect in the situation where you have a narrow piece of wood like this that you're cutting, and it keeps you away from the blade. Now here's a little piece that is very helpful, especially when you're cutting long pieces or you're cutting grooves or dados, and that is feather boards. Now these are homemade feather boards I made out of scrap wood. They don't look very pretty, but they do the job well. So the idea behind a feather board is you've got a piece of wood that you want to run through, and let's say you want to keep it from moving this way. So you clamp down a feather board to your table saw table and run the piece through. Also, a feather board will not allow a piece to kick back. It will go forward, but it will not come back. Now you can put two feather boards and hold the piece down as well as holding it tight against the fence. This is especially handy with long pieces of wood that you may have trouble managing and keeping flush against the fence as they go through. Feather boards will be your friends. Sometimes I like to put a feather board on the front side and on the back side. Sometimes you may find that your fence is too short. If you've got a long or tall or fat piece of wood that you're going to run through, then what you do is just take a piece of wood and clamp it or screw it to your fence. And this will help alleviate that problem and give you a taller fence. Now what you do not want to do is say, oh, well, let's take a piece like this and run it through. Never make a cheek cut like this holding it with your hands. I've got a better way to do that. Now here is a special jig. A special jig for making cheek cuts. Now with this jig, it fits in the groove and slides across. Now all we have to do is put our piece of wood in here, because we want to make a cheek cut. We'll clamp it down, and now we can run our piece through and make our cheek cut. This way, we keep our hands entirely away from the blade as well. Now let's say that you don't have one of those fancy jigs like I just had. So what you can do is you can make your own. And simply all you need to do is take a couple of blocks of scrap wood and make something like this, and make sure that it's perfectly perpendicular. And then you take a clamp and you clamp your piece of work that you want to make a cheek cut on. You clamp it to it, just like this. And then we'll get our square, our handy square. And now we can make our cheek cut like this as well. So let's talk about our square. Okay? Now, these are adjustable, and one of the things that you may notice is you got some grooves in here. Well, this is so that you can clamp other pieces of wood to it to make it longer if you need to. In the case of making box box cuts, box joints, I have made this little jig as well. I've got a screw in here that's set and ready, and all I have to do is put it on, put my little screw that I have in there. I'm going to put an extra clamp to hold it tight, and it's ready to go. Now this particular jig is set up so that I can make a dado exactly the same size of this little block of wood, and I keep moving over and I'll have exactly spaced grooves. Sometimes you might find a square that has special attachments like this one does. Now with this one, I can hold my piece in. It's got this little clamping mechanism. I hold it down and it doesn't go anywhere. I can run it through and keep my hands completely clear of the blade. It also has this handy little feature where I can set the length, and I can cut several pieces precisely the same length. Now let's say I have a short piece of wood and I want just a little piece off of it, or I find that I don't have enough to hold on to. There are two ways to handle this. One, we put a longer piece on our fence and we clamp the piece to our now extended fence on our square. Or the other thing is that we take this piece of wood, we glue it to another piece of wood that's longer, and then we cut it. If it's too short of a piece of wood to run through the saw, then you cannot cut it with the saw. Okay, let's talk about the chop saw or the miter saw. Now, a miter saw has a couple of safety features built into most of the modern ones these days. One is that we've got this guard that comes down just like this. So as long as you keep your hands out of the danger zone, and the danger zone is from here to here, as long as your hands are not in here, you're going to be in good shape. Now, the temptation is for people to take a short piece of wood and try to hold it with their hands close to the blade. Now, that's a mistake. So if you need to cut a short piece of wood, there's two ways to handle it. Of course, you could glue it to another piece of wood and cut it short, or the other thing is you could take a C-clamp and clamp it down, and then you have your hands completely out of the way while you're making the cut. Now, on this particular saw, I've got these two little red lines that tell me don't put my hands any closer than that. What other people do is they will also extend the table, either by building their own or getting some add-ons to go on the sides so you have more room over here to work with. Let's talk about the bandsaw. Now, a bandsaw, it's a temptation to get our fingers really close. Say we have a small piece of wood and we want to cut a curve in it, and look how close my hands are to the blade. Okay, so that's not going to be good right there. Of course, like we said before, glue it to a longer piece of wood if you're going to use this piece of wood, and use it to be able to steady yourself and keep your hands away from the blade. With a bandsaw, you have this guard for the blade. Now the guard goes up and down, and a lot of times people will push it up out of the way and they'll just start cutting wood with it. That's going to put a danger to your eyes and to your hands and make a hazard, and it's also going to make more vibration in the blade, and so you're not going to get as accurate as a cut. So whenever you have a piece of wood, first put it on the back side, drop the guard down, and just raise it up just a little bit and tighten up your guard. Now this will keep plenty of support to the blade, and it'll also help keep your hands away from the blade as well. Now let's say that you're going to cut a curve, and it's going to be a tight radius curve like this. So then what do? Well, you want to make some relief cuts first. Okay, so you come along and you make all these relief cuts where the turns get tight, and then when we make our cut, we'll cut these little pieces off. and it will put less stress on your blade and help you to make tighter turns on a bandsaw. Now here's a special cut that I've seen people do all wrong before, and that is to cut a taper for a leg. So a lot of times you'll have a blank that looks something like this, and what I've seen guys do in the past is they'll take a straight edge and they will mark their line, and then they'll take their wood and they'll line aside it and they'll start pushing it through. Now, do you see a problem with this? I do. This is not the way to do it, and this is number one way to get yourself in trouble. This is not how a table saw is made to be used. Okay? So let's do it the right way. Now, if you don't have a fancy jig, you can make your own, but this is a taper jig. And so what I have is I've got two pieces of wood. A little piece of wood I use for a hinge at the end, and then I've got this piece here, and I can unscrew, I'll open up the taper and re-screw it in this little piece of wood, and the wood also acts as a stop block. Now what you do is you use your fence and you bring it up close, and now wherever your taper starts, you're going to make a mark, and you're going to bring the blade up to it and clamp it down. Now, when we run the piece through, we'll run it together with our taper jig, and it will cut our taper in our wood. Now, of course, if you want to be extra safe, you can use some feather boards and clamps to hold this in place while you push it through. Now let's talk about the drill press. Now the drill press is a saw just like the other tools, it just cuts holes instead. Now the number one mistake people make with a drill press is they take a small piece of wood and they think they're going to hold it with their hands. Now if you have a long piece of wood like this, then you can drill into it because you've got a lot of stock to hold on to. Now if you don't, then take a clamp and clamp it to the table and then make your cut, drill your hole. Now you'll notice that you've got slots in here. These slots are so that you can buy special clamping devices that will slip in there and hold your work in place. So today I showed you some different ways that you can keep yourself safe using different jigs and devices on your power tools, namely the table saw, the drill press, the chop saw, and the bandsaw. Keep yourself safe in the wood shop. If you don't have time to set up a cut to do it properly with the jigs and the clamps, then you don't have time for woodworking. Be safe in the shop, otherwise you're a hazard to yourself and to others. And at the end of the day, I want you to have all 10 of these. Now let me share a couple of tips from professional woodworkers and experienced woodworkers who did have accidents. Number 1, don't woodwork when you're mad. Number 2, don't woodwork when you're tired. Number 3, use your guides and your guards, your jigs, feather boards, and push sticks. Remember, always think before you cut. Plan the cut, execute the cut as it was planned, and you'll minimize your risks. Remember, saws are dangerous things if they're not handled properly. But if they are handled properly, we can make lots of wonderful things with them and keep ourselves safe. Thanks for joining us this time on the American Garage, and we'll see you next time.